Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and yes, that's right, folks. We're back with the Truth Attack. Okay, so we are the Liberty Works Radio Network, and we do need the support of the members of the listening audience to keep the broadcast network operating. So, if you enjoy the shows, the information, the lectures, the discussions, the revelations, the guests and the hosts on the other shows of the network, we sure would appreciate it if you could find your way over to the LibertyWorksRadioNetwork.com. Get signed up as a monthly subscribing member, even if it's as little as $10, $15, $20 a month. Every membership helps, and we do need the support of the audience to keep the broadcast network operating. Okay, that's LibertyWorksRadioNetwork.com. Get signed up. Tell friends and family you can listen online using the online listening radio link on the left side of the screen. You just click that and give it 10, 15 seconds to connect, and you'll hear the live stream. And if you want to get fully informed on my favorite topic on this particular version of the Truth Attack Hour every Thursday evening at 6 o'clock, you find your way over to the taxfreedom.com website and start reading, get educated, because the country is waking up to the fact that the income tax is indeed one great, big, huge constitutional fraud, and that has been exposed by the Supreme Court in a ruling they handed down a year and a half ago, which completely contradicts every ruling every circuit court in the country has been making for 45 years. It contradicts what the IRS has been doing in assessing the tax as a direct tax without limitation that's unavoidable and authorized allegedly under the 16th Amendment as unconstitutional. So the Supreme Court has cut them down. It's just a matter of time before the rest of you find out what has been done, because, of course, the mainstream media isn't telling you this has been done. They're letting you think everything's going on just fine and dandy. But as I exposed last week, we don't have a tax system in this country. None of the money taken from your paychecks all year long, and none of the money sent in on April 15th ends up in the United States Treasury as required by law of all collected and paid taxes. Of course, tax is money for the government to spend. If it's not in the Treasury, the government can't spend it. So, of course, there's a law that says all taxes collected and paid must be deposited in the United States Treasury. So the question is, how come none of the money is deposited in the United States Treasury? None of the money taken out of your paycheck goes to the Treasury. If it did, you wouldn't have to file because the tax has already been paid. But there is no record of any tax having been paid, is there? No, there's no record at all of any tax being paid until you file 4 months later on April 15th. How the hell is that possible? When the law, Title 26, Section 7809, says every single penny of money collected as tax must be deposited in the U.S. Treasury on a daily basis, and in conjunction with that deposit, a receipt is created showing the name, the account number, and the amount of tax paid. So you should already have, there should already be a record of you paying tax on January 5th. All the money taken from your paycheck sent in by your employer at the end of each quarter has all been deposited in the United States Treasury as tax paid and credited to your account by law. But that doesn't exist. There's no record of tax paid. That's why you have to file, right? So if the law says all tax collected has to be deposited, how come none of it is going to the Treasury? And on April 15th, the check you send in, that doesn't go to the Treasury to fund the government either. You want proof? Get the check back from your bank, both sides, front and back, and see what it says on the back of the check. If it says deposit to the U.S. Treasury, I'm wrong. You can call me up and claim the $1,000. I'm wrong. But if it doesn't say that, you need to wake up. What do you think it says? You think it says deposit to the U.S. Treasury? No, it doesn't say that. It says pay to NEF, period, R, period, B, period, FRB, in capital letters. Federal Reserve Bank, a private corporation. Why is a private corporation cashing your so-called tax check? That's not tax. And that's why they're cashing it. And the government knows it's not tax, which is why none of the money collected and sent in by employers through withholding, none of it goes to the Treasury. Because it's not tax. There's no tax imposed on the labor of the American people. That's judicial legislation made up by communist judges enforcing the second plank of the Communist Manifesto to pair with the fifth plank of the Communist Manifesto. Both planks of which the manifesto were written into law in America in 1913. So we're going to get into that in a bit. But we don't have a tax system here. We have a peonage debt service system. All the money is being taken from the labors of the American people and from their earnings, sent to the Federal Reserve Bank to symbolize, show the Federal Reserve Bank that the American people are idiots, willing to labor all year long to collateralize the $40 trillion in debt unconstitutionally run up by Congress and owed collectively by America, so that the politicians can stay in power and keep stealing from the productive and buying the votes of the ignorant, the sloth, the lazy, the corrupt. Steal from the productive to buy the votes of the masses. And then try to push democracy. Democracy, majority rules, majority rules. Let's have a popular election for president instead of a state election system that preserves the rights of the states, which are supposed to be the authority on all the lands and territories in the states, not the federal government. They've weaseled their way in by having this monopoly on money, which lets them bribe the states to adopt central federal policy in all arenas: education, agriculture, energy, healthcare. We're not supposed to have centralized systems in these. It can't succeed. It bankrupts the nation, guaranteed. These are state areas where the states and the competition between the states develops the 5 or 6 different systems that work with the various demographics we have in the United States. Because you can bet the healthcare system they come up with in New York City isn't going to work in Wyoming or Utah. You have different demographics. Everybody's jammed together in New York City. You build a hospital and tell the people to go there. You can't do that in Wyoming. People are spread out all over the state. You need a way to get them to the hospital. You're going to come up with different systems. Agriculture. Different products grow better in different regions. Why is the federal government having the whole country grow corn? Why are they subsidizing the $100 million growers in corn and sugar? Why is the government involved in agriculture? That's not in the Constitution. Energy, not in the Constitution. Education, not in the Constitution. This is all socialism being funded by the second plank of the Communist Manifesto, a progressive or graduated income tax. Communism being enforced by judicial legislation. The judges made it all up. They made up the direct tax under the 16th Amendment. They made up the liability for tax. They made up the form requirement to file the Form 1040. Every single bit of the income tax enforcement is 100% made up judicial legislation. Got nothing to do with legitimate indirect taxation by imposed foreigners, foreign activity, foreign imports in foreign places, duty, exported goods, and by excise, commodities, licenses, and corporations. Labor isn't there. That's why they had to make it up. It's never been the subject of federal tax. That's why none of the money taken from your paycheck goes to the Treasury. It goes to the Federal Reserve Bank to collateralize the $40 trillion in debt. The reason why it doesn't go to the Treasury, because if there was an emergency, Congress could run down to the Treasury and borrow against the accumulated deposits to send money to California for the earthquake or to Florida for the hurricane or to wherever that's needed for the natural disaster that's occurred. Oh, but if the money isn't deposited in the Treasury after it's collected each quarter, then Congress can't run to it and use those funds to address an emergency, can they? What do? Just not do anything and let the people in the emergency area yell and scream about the federal government's incompetence on the news for a month? Well, yeah, they kind of do that too, don't they? But what they do is they run over to the Federal Reserve Bank and borrow another $1 billion because it's not available at the Treasury because the system denies them the use of revenues so that they always have to borrow. 20 trillion, 30 trillion, 40 trillion, 50 trillion, 60 trillion. How high will it go before the whole ship just blows? How high will it go? So how did we get here? How did we get here? Well, I explained, or have explained before, that in 1913, the Democrats in power virtually adopted the Communist Manifesto in place of the Constitution. They adopted the 16th Amendment, which in effect did absolutely nothing because there's no enabling enforcement clause in it to authorize Congress to write any new law. But Americans aren't educated about how the Constitution works, so they don't understand that without an enabling enforcement clause, there is nothing Congress can do, claiming the 16th Amendment as the authority to do it. There is no direct tax. There's no new tax under the 16th Amendment. But they used it to lie to the American people. And of course, they didn't impose a tax right away. They imposed a tax that only taxed foreign persons and in foreign places, the jurisdiction Congress has under the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. And that's pretty much how it was enforced up until World War II. But let's go back. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. We've reviewed what we went over last week, which is that you don't have a tax system. You have a peonage debt service system based on the second and the fifth planks of the Communist Manifesto, which both appeared in law in America, the Federal Reserve Bank being the fifth plank, and the income tax being the second. And they need to go together because you can't print all this excess currency and put it into circulation unless you've got some back-end mechanism to remove the currency from the hands of the people so that there's never too much currency in the hands of the people to drive inflation or to pursue too few goods and drive the cost up, which is inflation. Too much money chasing too few goods. So the Federal Reserve Bank pumps the money into existence by buying the notes from the United States Treasury for 4 cents a note. So they put up $400 for $1 million, $10,100 bills. They pay $400, and then they lend that money back into the private sector at full face value and to the government at full face value. So for every $400 the government takes in to print $1 million, it owes to the Federal Reserve Bank $1,030,000 in interest every year, 3%. So it's inescapable, and the debt can never be repaid because if we gather up every single currency and credit in existence and give it all back to the Federal Reserve Bank so that there is no principal left in circulation, what will happen? You'll have no money in circulation. There's no money, there's no currency, there's nothing but a barter system. And, surprise, you're not done. They never printed the interest. 1 month later, all the mortgages are foreclosed. Okay, we'll be back in 5. This is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. I'm pretty sure I hear that commercial break coming up, so stay tuned in. We'll be back in 5. Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and I'm just going to get right back into this. So, as I was saying, as the commercial break came up, how did we get into this unconstitutional system where the Congress borrows fiat notes that take the place of honest money, which has inherent value and thus is evidence of debt? And up until the Civil War, the Constitution, of course, it's actually still today, the Constitution says no state shall make anything but gold and silver coin a legal tender in payment of debt. That's Article 1, Section 10, one of the clauses. I think it's Clause 3, not sure. But gold and silver coin, no state shall make anything but gold and silver coin a legal tender in payment. Now, this is a power to declare legal tender that is denied to the states. And as a power denied to the states, it is also not a power granted to the federal government. And thus, the power of legal tender is left with the sovereign citizen, the two individuals conducting the transaction. This is a power reserved to we the people under the 10th Amendment. It's not a power granted to the federal government, and it is a power prohibited to the states. As such, it is reserved to we the people. No one can declare a legal tender. So how do we get to the point where Federal Reserve notes are legal tender? By statute. Well, obviously, the statute's unconstitutional, isn't it? Of course it is. There's no change to the Constitution that says we're throwing away gold and silver coin or adopting worthless notes, which are evidence of debt. Real money, honest money, is evidence of asset. That's why it's gold and silver. Gold and silver have inherent value. The coin itself has value. The note is toilet paper. It has no inherent value. It's evidence that you owe somebody money. It's not evidence that you have any money. So we gave the bank the power to print notes, but was that the first time? No. Where does this all really begin? Well, it goes back to the beginning of the Civil War, where in the first days of the Civil War, at Fort Sumter, the Confederates fired on the Union, which was blockading Charleston or threatening to, and that started the war. The South succeeded, and everybody started pulling together an army. Lincoln in Washington, D.C., took all the money he had in the treasury, used it to raise a Union army and to arm them, which they then sent out to do battle with the Confederates at the First Battle of Bull Run, just outside of Manassas, Virginia, about 45, 50 miles outside the city, Northern Virginia. And the North thought that the collective wealth and strength of the collective states in the North could oppose the individual states in the South, which didn't have the federal government to organize them as a collective government. They had to form their own government under Jefferson Davis, and it was anticipated they wouldn't be able to oppose Union forces. So the Union Army, Lincoln spent all the money he had in the treasury, armed the Union, and sent them out to do battle at the Battle of Little Bull Run, first 50 miles outside of D.C., as I said. And for the morning, it was the picnic that the Union expected. In fact, lots of people from Washington, D.C. rode out in carriages to try and watch the battle from the hillside. And for the whole beginning of the morning, the Union Army, the forces were successful in pushing the Confederate back. But throughout the morning, Confederate forces were using the train system to bring in reserves. And in the afternoon, this is where Stonewall Jackson gets his name. He lines his men up behind a ridge. When the Union forces, advancing recklessly, come over the ridge, they're met with a volley fire from Jefferson's forces that wiped them out and reversed the charge into a retreat. And the Confederates pursued, having been much stronger from all of the troops arriving throughout the morning, now reaching the battlefield. So this single event in the battlefield turned the tide, and it was Stonewall Jackson for the Confederates that did it with strategic deployment of troops. So the Union Army was so upset by this reversal of fortune on the field, and they were untrained, remember. These are new guys who just got picked up, no training, sent right out to do battle against what they thought would be inferior forces. But the Confederates had the better marksmen and shooters, and once the numbers were equal, the Confederates just blew the Union off the field. They literally dropped their weapons, left behind the cannons, and ran back to D.C. The spectators on the hills picnicking got overrun by Confederate soldiers and all had to leave too. So Lincoln is sitting there with the Union Army straggled back, and he has no forces, no defenses between he and the Confederate Army, and he has no money left in the treasury. Stonewall Jackson wired Jefferson Davis in Richmond, said the Union has fled the field. There's no one between me and D.C. I'm moving on D.C. will win this war in 4 days. Jefferson Davis wrote back in a telegram, no, Confederate troops will only be used to defend Confederate soil. No assault on Washington, D.C. Thomas Jackson was so upset by this denial of authority to end the war, he quit. Took him a year and a half to get him to come back. He was their very best commander. They lost him in the first day because Jefferson Davis wouldn't authorize the assault on D.C. to end the war. So Lincoln is sitting there in D.C. absolutely sure the Confederates are coming to end the war. And he has no money left in the treasury to rearm troops or to put cannon in front of the Confederates. He's got nothing left. And at this point in time, the British bankers approached Lincoln. And they said to him, hey, it looks like you got a problem, man. You got the Confederates about to cross the Potomac, overrun the city, and win this war in 5 days. You got no troops, no money, no armament, nobody in front of them. What are you going to do? And Lincoln's like, yeah, right. What are we going to do? And the European bankers said, well, we have a solution for you. We will let you borrow as much money as you need immediately to buy new arms, munitions, and rearm the troops so that you can quickly put defenses up in Washington, D.C. against the Confederates. All you got to do to get this unlimited access to capital is let us become the U.S. Bank. And we'll manage all your affairs for you from now on. We'll save your ass now, and we'll help you in the future, too. And Lincoln said, gee, guys, thanks, but let me think about it. And then what he said is, in essence, what the hell do I need you for? You're going to print money and give it to me? Why don't I just print money? We'll call it greenbacks. So without making them legal tender, Lincoln printed greenbacks and used them to pay all of the contractors producing munitions, weapons, and other materials for the war effort on the Union side. And if you wanted a contract to produce goods, you had to take greenbacks in payment, pay your workers in greenbacks, and so they began circulating in the contracting community in the North, which of course is where all the money was being spent. So they got accepted and used, and people traded them as though they were dollars. So that put greenbacks into circulation. Lincoln basically stole the bankers' idea and program and business. And there's a lot of people that believe that's why he was assassinated at the end of the war. John Wilkes Booth was an actor. In the 1860s, the 1850s, 60s, it was very hard to make a living as an actor. You didn't get paid. The only way you could be an actor was if you had a benefactor, a very wealthy person that kind of sponsored your career and gave you a monthly stipend so that you could live and pursue acting on the stage. And who was John Wilkes Booth's benefactor? As a career actor, John Wilkes Booth had a benefactor. You know who it was? Rothschild. Rothschild, the European banker that tried to get Lincoln to give him the banking powers. Though I got screwed by the greenbacks. So a lot of people think Rothschild put John Wilkes Booth up to murdering Lincoln because he stole the greenbacks, the paper money idea, and used it himself. So the greenbacks were in circulation. They saved the Union Army. We all know how things turned out in the end. Ultimately, the greenbacks were retired from circulation as the European bankers worked tirelessly to try and establish and impose a U.S. banking system. They'd been defeated by Jackson. They were then defeated again by Lincoln. They kept working at it, and as you know, by 1913, the Democrats in power under Wilson created the Federal Reserve Bank. And in conjunction with creating the Federal Reserve Bank, the same year, 1913, they passed the 16th Amendment, creating the income tax. These two pieces of law go hand in hand. You can't print paper money unless you have a tax that removes it from the hands of the population so that they never have too much. So both the federal income tax and the Federal Reserve Bank were created in 1913. And they created, a few years later, a legal tender law that said Federal Reserve notes are legal tender, and that statute is unconstitutional. That's not a power granted to Congress. It is a power specifically prohibited to the states. It's not specifically granted to the federal government. It is therefore reserved to we the people, who are the only persons who should determine what is an acceptable payment in any transaction occurring between two parties. Who else should have a say about what's acceptable between the two parties? If I'll take furs for my gunpowder and bullets, who is the government to dictate that I have to take gold and silver coin? I can make my own legal tender for my own transactions in a barter society, in a barter system, and the government's got nothing to say about it, nor do they get any tax on it. That's all nonsense. There's no invasion of private affairs between two parties in the 50 states. They just need to do that to keep the currency from overflowing and becoming worthless. And, the American people had experience with this. The reason why they put in the Constitution gold and silver coin is because the Founding Fathers had just experienced the inflation of paper money by issuing the Continental Notes, as worthless as a Continental. Of course, it's a saying that hasn't been heard much since World War I, but as worthless as a Continental was because all the paper notes the Continental Congress printed to fund the Revolutionary War were abandoned. They were worthless. Nobody got paid. Nobody would take them. They were unusable paper money. So they knew paper money was worthless. That's why they put gold and silver coin. No state can do anything else. States can't issue notes, and nobody else can either. And especially not a private bank, which has effectively been given a monopoly on currency and credit. Which is why we have a peonage debt service system of involuntary servitude by voluntary ignorance. We don't have a tax system. It's a debt service system. You're not working to fund the government. You're working to maintain the viability of using worthless paper in place of real money or real assets. And if you're saving paper money, God help you. If you're saving paper money, quick, convert it into silver. Gold's a little high, but get out of paper. Don't save paper. Buy stocks that are earning money. We'll be back in 5. This is Thomas Freed. We got more. It says the Liberty Works Radio Network. Stay tuned in. Get informed. We'll be back. Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and let's just get right back into this. So, we had Lincoln putting greenbacks in play, and they get taken out a little while later. But the Fabians of the era, we get to the 1890s, and they're still trying to impose an income tax, i.e., a second plank of the Communist Manifesto. And in 1896, we have the Supreme Court decision of Pollock v. Farmers Loan and Trust, which says that the income tax law they were testing in that case, because it was a tax on revenue streaming from property, it was in effect a tax on the property, which was a direct tax and could not be sustained for want of apportionment to the states for payment of the direct tax, which was deemed to be direct on rent streaming from properties. So they strike down the income tax and say it's not constitutional because this would be a direct tax that has to be apportioned. So that really ticked off the progressive Fabianists, the liberals, the Democrats, and they spend the next 20 years trying to amend the Constitution, ultimately getting to passing the 16th Amendment in 1913 under Wilson, who was Democrat president. In conjunction with passing the income tax, they create the Federal Reserve Bank. Now, of course, as I said, without the enabling enforcement clause, this is not an amendment that authorizes Congress to write any new law for application in the 50 states. Is there any evidence of that in the law? Well, why don't we go look at what the statute said in 1939, 26 years after the income tax was adopted and written into law. So in 1939, what do you think? Do you think they had the income tax all accurately captured in the law? Or do you think they left things out at that point in time? 26 years later. Yeah, that's right. They had it all accurately captured in the law. So let's look at what that says about what's in the law. Here we are in the 1939 Statutes at Large, the Internal Revenue Code, Volume 53, Part 1. And here we are, Chapter 1, Income Tax. And here we go, Section 4, Special Classes of Taxpayers. Now, these are the persons, all the classes of persons subject to the 1913 income tax legislation. What's it say? The application of the general provisions and of supplements A to D, inclusive to each of the following special classes of taxpayers, shall be subject to the exceptions and additional provisions found in the supplement applicable to such class, as follows. A, estates and trusts and the beneficiaries thereof, supplement E. B, members of partnerships. C, insurance companies. D, non-resident alien individuals. E, foreign corporations. F, individual citizens of any possession of the United States who are not otherwise citizens of the United States and who are not residents of the United States. Persons in a possession of the United States. G, individual citizens of the United States or domestic corporations satisfying the conditions of Section 251 by reason of deriving a large portion of their gross income from sources within a possession of the United States. H, China Trade Act corporations. I, foreign personal holding companies and their shareholders. J, mutual investment companies. That's the end of the list. These are the only classes of taxpayers subject to tax. And what do we have? We have estates, partnerships, businesses, and insurance companies all subject to the income tax as an excise on their corporate business. We have non-resident aliens, foreign corporations, and persons in the possessions and earning money from within the possessions, all subject to the income tax as an impost on foreign activity. Non-resident aliens, foreign corporations, possessions, citizens in the possessions, earning money in the possessions. China, foreign personal holding companies. This is all foreign. It's a foreign tax imposed on foreign persons. The only duty of citizens is to collect it from foreign persons, as the tax collectors performing in the capacity of withholding agents, who were the original tax collectors in the 1913 income tax law. Employers don't become tax collectors until 1945 in the Subtitle C employment tax laws. In 1913, this is all collected by withholding agents, which I've repeatedly shown only are authorized to collect tax from foreign persons and then are made liable for the tax under Section 1461. There is no direct tax on you because you're in the States. It's only in the possessions, and it's not direct. It's an impost. It's indirect. It feels direct, but the privilege being taxed by the impost is being protected by the federal government in the possession, where the cavalry's going to ride in and kill the Indians before they murder you and rape your wife. Well, being protected in the possessions is the privilege that lets them tax all persons in those possessions and territories as though it were a direct tax. It's not. It's indirect based on the privilege enjoyed, the protection provided by the federal government in that territory and possession, where the federal government is the territorial authority and has the legislative jurisdiction to write tax law for that space. Because there is no state. It's all foreign. 1939 law, 26 years after 1913, every single bit of this is foreign or excise, imposts or excise. There is no taxation of the American people. That happens as a function of the law in 1913. So what happened? Well, what happened is World War II and the victory tax. World War II and the victory tax created the situation where everybody was taxed on their labor temporarily for 2 years to fund the war. And if you objected, you probably got tossed in a Japanese internment camp for being a Nazi or a Jap sympathizer. So nobody objected. They got away with it. And after 2 years of withholding the victory tax from the wages of everybody working, and again, everybody in the country was working after the Depression for the government contracts to fund the war, just like in the Civil War. So you had to accept the tax as an employee. If you wanted your company, if the company wanted to have the work, everybody had to accept the tax. And they got away with it. Everybody did. They were glad to have the work. Because, of course, for the previous 10 years, the Depression, the 1930s, nobody had any money or any work. They were glad to get the work, and they didn't mind giving up a little bit for the tax. So they slipped it through with the victory tax. And maybe we should talk a little bit about how that happened, right? Because, of course, in 1913, they created the income tax in the Federal Reserve Bank. They started printing money. That money was made accessible to the wealth of society because the common man didn't have much access to capital from 1913 to 1920, but the wealthy man did. So there was a lot of wealth and productivity, and of course, it resulted in paper money being plentiful, and that gave us the Roaring Twenties, which resulted in the common man finally getting access to capital and deciding to go ahead and speculate on a stock market that was at highs. And of course, when all the capital was drawn into the market in speculative investments, the market collapsed and fell. All the money was lost. And the banks deemed the American people no longer creditworthy because they couldn't come up with collateral. They lost all the collateral in the foreclosures that occurred as a result of the margin calls when the stock fell and all the bad investments went belly up and all the stocks went under. So without any capital, the banks refused to lend to the common man, but they didn't stop collecting the monthly debt. So every month they collected the mortgage payments and the car payments and the house payments and the business loans, but they didn't lend the money out. Every month there was less and less capital available in society for anyone to make any payment. And as there's less and less capital, people began to hoard what capital they had, which resulted in even less capital. And pretty soon you had the Depression. Not because There wasn't any work to do, but because nobody had any capital to pay anyone, because the bank wasn't lending into a bankrupt society. They stopped lending the paper money after they made the paper money the only medium of exchange that guarantees a depression. The banks didn't figure that out. And it took the Lend-Lease Act to convince the bankers to start lending money to the government, which was lent to Europe, which was immediately sent back to America to pay for the goods that America was shipping to the Europeans to build the war under the Lend-Lease Act. So that's what restarted capital financing. It led to World War II, America being involved, and the Victory Tax, a 2-year tax that lasted from 1942 to 1945 through 44. When the Victory Tax expired, the World War II debt had been 90% paid off. Congress looked around and said, holy smokes, we can't let this power die. We just paid off the whole war debt in 2 years. We can't let this power die. But they couldn't write another tax because World War II was over. 1945, the war closed down. It wouldn't take another tax for another 2 years. So what they did was they wrote a new law. The current Subtitle C laws that we have in Title 26, implementing the employment tax withholding, where under the statute, there is no tax imposed anymore. The Victory Tax expired. The income tax was only on foreigners and the citizens. So they created a system where there no longer is any tax imposed on the labor of the American people. But there's a W-4 form for you to request that it be withheld, even though it doesn't exist. So you ask your employer to withhold tax, and he does exactly what you say. He takes out whatever you specified. Usually it starts with single and zero when you're 14 to 16. And that traps you because it teaches you to claim single and zero or married and two. And that triggers withholding, which means money's taken out of your paycheck. You have to file a Form 1040 to get a refund for an alleged tax that was never imposed on you in the first place. But once you file the Form 1040, now you're liable for the tax because there is no liability in statute. The liability that exists is all in regulation. Here it is. Income tax on individuals, 26 CFR 1.1-1. One is income tax, and this pretty much is what the statute says, imposes an income tax on the income of every individual. And down here in C, B, citizens or residents of the United States liable to tax. In general, all citizens of the United States, wherever resident, and all resident alien individuals are liable to the income tax. And there it is. There's a regulation that goes beyond what the statute says. There's no liability in the statute. This is Chevron and regulatory deference helping judicial legislation make up, through regulations, a direct tax that was made up under the 16th Amendment, that was made up as an authority to tax. Every single bit of it is judicial legislation. There's no enabling enforcement clause. There's no authority to write law. There's no new power created. There's no direct taxation. There's no liability for tax in the statute. It's all made up to enforce the Communist Manifesto, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. To go along with the fifth plank of the Communist Manifesto, a Federal Reserve Bank with a monopoly on currency and credit that prints money into circulation for the government to spend at full face value, for the population to experience the deflated, inflated worthlessness in value when it gets to them to spend. So the whole system is one of theft. We'll be back next week with more. This is Thomas Fried on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is Thomas Fried on the Liberty Works Radio Network. We'll be back next week with more on why you need to get educated. That's okay.
surprise me. Ex-President Trump in an